Elena Winter sat at her kitchen table, the familiar weight of desperation settling over her as she counted coins for the third time that week. The numbers never changed, not enough for rent, barely enough for groceries, and nothing left for the new shoes Thomas needed. The simple gold band on her finger caught the dim light as she twisted it absently, a habit she'd developed since David's funeral. The ring had belonged to his grandmother, passed down through generations of happier marriages than theirs had been toward the end. Through the thin walls of their apartment above Murphy's Diner in Charleston, she could hear the clatter of dishes and muffled conversations. Thomas was at school, where she prayed no one noticed his worn shoes, or the fact that his winter coat was now 2 sizes too small. Working in hospital laundry wasn't glamorous, but it paid regularly and came with health insurance. That had been everything when Thomas got sick last winter. The knock at her door came at precisely 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. She remembered because she'd been watching the clock, calculating how many hours until her evening shift began. The man standing in her hallway wore a suit that cost more than she made in 3 months. His business card read, Thompson and Associates Estate Planning, and he carried a leather briefcase that smelled of money and old decisions. Mrs. Winters, I'm here about your husband's Uncle Gregory Stone's estate. He passed away 6 weeks ago, left you some property in West Virginia. Elena stared at him, confusion momentarily replacing her weariness. David had never mentioned an Uncle Gregory. Her husband's family wasn't close. His parents had died when he was young, and he'd been raised by his grandmother. The same grandmother whose ring now adorned Elena's finger, too valuable to pawn, but too meaningful to remove. She invited the lawyer in because Thomas was at school, and the neighbors didn't need to hear her business. Mr. Thompson spread documents across her small kitchen table with the precision of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news to strangers. Your husband's uncle owned 43 acres surrounding a small lake in Hancock County. He lived as something of a hermit, no other living relatives, and he specifically named you as his heir. The property includes the lake, several outbuildings, and a small residence. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. What's the catch? Thompson smiled, though not warmly. No catch exactly. But I should mention the property has been on the market intermittently for 20 years with no buyers. The land isn't suitable for farming. There's no road access except a dirt trail. And the lake has some sort of local reputation that makes people reluctant to purchase. Something about an old mining accident. Local folklore, mostly. The point is, the property has virtually no market value. You could try to sell it, but nobody wants it. Elena set the papers down, studying the deed to 40 acres of what this expensive lawyer clearly considered worthless swampland. I wouldn't call it worthless. Thompson adjusted his glasses. It's land and the taxes are current. Mr. Stone was quite conscientious about that. There's also a small trust fund established for maintenance. Nothing substantial, but enough to keep the county from seizing it for back taxes. After Thompson left, Elena sat at her kitchen table, staring at the deed until Thomas came home from school. He bounded through the door with grass stains on his knees and a crumpled permission slip for a field trip she couldn't afford. The contrast between his bright energy and their dingy apartment had never felt more stark. Mom, what's all this paper? She pulled him onto her lap, breathing in the scent of playground dust and little boy sweat. We inherited some land, sweetheart, from your daddy's family. Thomas's eyes widened. Like a farm. Sort of. It's got a lake. Can we go see it? Elena looked around their cramped apartment, at the water stains spreading across the ceiling, at the kitchen faucet that dripped no matter how many times she asked the landlord to fix it, at the stack of overdue notices she'd been hiding. Then she looked at her son's hopeful face and made a decision that surprised them both. Pack your things, baby. We're going to West Virginia. The drive took them through mountain country that seemed forgotten by time. As they climbed higher into the hills, radio stations faded to static and cell phone service disappeared. Elena followed Thompson's directions, turning off increasingly smaller roads until they were bouncing along a rutted dirt track barely wide enough for her aging sedan. Are we lost? Thomas asked from the passenger seat, his nose pressed against the window. I hope not. The trees closed in around them, thick oak and maple blocking most of the afternoon sun. After years of city noise and exhaust fumes, the silence felt disconcertingly absolute. They found the lake by accident. Elena missed the final turn Thompson had described, and the dirt road simply ended at a clearing. She parked the car, and they both climbed out, stretching legs cramped from hours of driving. "Oh," Thomas whispered. Devil's Hollow stretched before them like a dark mirror, reflecting the overcast sky. It wasn't large, maybe 3 acres of water, surrounded by dense forest, but there was something about its stillness that made Elena catch her breath. The water was so dark she couldn't see the bottom, and the shoreline was littered with debris from some long-abandoned human presence. Rusted barrels lined the water's edge like sentinels. The remains of several small buildings dotted the clearing, most reduced to foundation stones and rotting timber, but one structure still stood intact enough to offer shelter. It had been a cabin once built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to silver gray. The roof sagged and several windows were broken, but the walls looked solid. "Is this ours?" Thomas asked, his voice small against the vastness of the forest. Elena consulted the property description Thompson had given her. All of it, the lake, the buildings, everything you can see, and about 20 acres more beyond those trees. Thomas ran toward the water's edge and Elena's heart jumped. "Careful, baby. Stay away from the deep parts." But Thomas had already discovered something that captured his attention completely. He knelt at the shoreline, poking at something half buried in the muddy sand with a stick he'd found. "Mom, look at all this old stuff." Elena walked over to see what he'd found. The debris field was more extensive than she'd first realized. Pieces of metal machinery stuck up from the shallow water, like the bones of some mechanical beast. Glass bottles in various states of decay were scattered along the shore, some still intact, others reduced to smooth-edged fragments. And everywhere the rusted remnants of human activity, tools, pipes, unidentifiable metal objects slowly being reclaimed by the earth. "What happened here?" Thomas asked, holding up a corroded piece of metal that might once have been a tool. Elena didn't have an answer. The silence felt heavy around them, as if the lake itself was holding secrets. She found herself studying the water, looking for some clue about why Uncle Gregory had lived here alone for so many years, why no one wanted to buy the property, why the locals called it Devil's Hollow. "We should look at the cabin, see if it's livable." The interior of the cabin was better preserved than she'd expected. Someone, presumably Uncle Gregory, had maintained the basic structure, even if he'd neglected cosmetic details. The floor was solid hardwood. The stone fireplace looked functional, and while the furniture was sparse and outdated, it appeared clean. Elena found Uncle Gregory's presence everywhere in small details, a coffee cup still sitting on the kitchen counter, half filled with something that had long since evolved into a science experiment. A pair of work boots by the door, sized for a man much larger than David had been. A shelf of books about local history, geology, and mining techniques. In the bedroom, clothes hung in the closet, flannel shirts, work pants, a heavy coat that smelled of wood smoke and old tobacco. On the nightstand sat a photograph of a young couple she didn't recognize, dressed in clothes from maybe 40 years ago. "Mom, come look at this," Thomas called from somewhere outside. She found him on the back porch where Uncle Gregory had apparently spent time watching the lake. An old rocking chair faced the water, and beside it sat a small table covered with what looked like maps and documents. Elena gathered them up carefully. They seemed important, though she couldn't immediately understand why. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Elena made a decision that would have terrified her 3 months ago. She found sheets in a cedar chest, made up the beds with linens that smelled of lavender and long storage, and began the process of making Devil's Hollow their home. That first night, she lay awake listening to sounds she'd never heard before, the gentle lap of water against the shore, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the deep silence that only comes in places far from civilization. Beside her, Thomas slept peacefully, one small hand curled around the flashlight he'd insisted on keeping nearby. For the first time in months, Elena felt something that might have been hope. Elena spent their first week at Devil's Hollow in a fog of practical necessity. The cabin needed work, basic repairs that she tackled with tools she found in Uncle Gregory's shed and determination born of having nowhere else to go. She patched holes in the roof with spare shingles, replaced broken window panes with cardboard and duct tape, and scrubbed years of bachelor neglect from every surface. Thomas, meanwhile, treated their new home like the greatest adventure of his 7 years. While Elena worked inside, he explored the shoreline with the systematic thoroughness that only children possess. He collected interesting rocks, cataloged the various pieces of debris, and constructed elaborate theories about what had happened at the lake in the mysterious past. "I think there were pirates here," he announced on their third day, presenting Elena with a corroded piece of metal he'd dug from the shore. "This looks like part of a sword." Elena examined the rusted fragment. I think it's probably from some old mining equipment, baby. This whole area used to be mining country, or it could be from a treasure chest. Pirates always buried treasure by water. She ruffled his hair, amused by his imagination. Sure, sweetheart, you keep looking. By the end of the week, Elena had established a routine. Mornings were for repairs and maintenance. Afternoons, she drove the winding mountain roads to the nearest town, Fairmont, 20 miles away, where she'd found work at a small medical clinic. The pay wasn't much, but it covered their basic needs and gave her something to do while Thomas explored their new world. The drive also provided opportunities to learn about their new community. At the gas station, the grocery store, the diner, where she sometimes stopped for coffee, Elena picked up fragments of local knowledge about Devil's Hollow and the hermit who'd lived there. Gregory Stone kept to himself, the woman at the grocery store told her. Came to town maybe once a month for supplies. Always paid cash. Never said more than necessary. Polite enough, but you could tell he didn't want company. Did he ever mention why he lived out there alone? The woman shook her head. That lake's got a bad reputation going back generations. Something about a mining accident in the old days. Folks just stay away from it now. Similar conversations yielded similar information. Uncle Gregory had been known but not welcomed, tolerated but not befriended. And Devil's Hollow carried a weight of local superstition that no one wanted to explain in detail. Elena might have dismissed the local folklore entirely if not for Thomas's increasingly focused behavior around the lake. Her son had always been an imaginative child, but there was something different about the way he interacted with their new environment. He spent hours standing at the water's edge completely still, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. "What are you doing out there?" she asked one evening as they ate dinner on the back porch. "Just watching," Thomas said. "The water's different in different places. Some parts are shallow, and some parts are really deep. And there's things under there." "What kind of things?" "Old things, important things." He looked at her with the serious expression that meant he was working through something complicated in his 7-year-old mind. "I think the pirates really did hide treasure here, Mom. I can feel it." Elena wanted to discourage his treasure hunting fantasies. She'd seen too many children disappointed by the gap between imagination and reality. But there was something in Thomas's certainty that made her pause. Her son had always been intuitive about things other people missed. He'd known David was sick before the doctors found the cancer. He could predict thunderstorms hours before the weather service issued warnings. Maybe he was sensing something real about the lake. On their 10th day at Devil's Hollow, Thomas made his discovery. Elena was inside the cabin trying to coax hot water from the temperamental plumbing system when she heard Thomas shouting from the lake. Not the excited shouting of a child at play, but urgent calls that made her drop everything and run. She found him waist-deep in the water near the north shore, struggling with something heavy. "Mom, help me." "I found it. I found the treasure chest. It's real, Mom, just like I said." Elena waded into the lake, her shoes squelching in the muddy bottom, and saw what had captured Thomas's attention. Half buried in the lake bed, covered in decades of sediment and algae, was a metal container roughly the size of a suitcase. It had handles on both sides and what looked like a hinged lid secured with some kind of clasp mechanism. "Help me pull it out," Thomas pleaded. "It's really heavy." Against her better judgment, Elena grabbed one handle while Thomas took the other. The chest was indeed heavy, much heavier than its size suggested, and it took both of them working together to drag it through the shallow water to the shore. "Careful with it," Elena said as they set it down on dry land. "That metal looks pretty corroded. We don't want it to fall apart." Up close, the chest was even more intriguing. Despite decades underwater, it appeared to be in remarkably good condition. The metal was blackened and pitted, but structurally sound. More importantly, it was clearly very old. The craftsmanship spoke of a time when such things were built to last. "Can we open it?" Thomas asked, bouncing with excitement. Elena examined the clasp mechanism. It was corroded but not completely frozen. With some effort, she managed to work it loose. The lid opened with a grinding protest of old metal, revealing contents that made both of them gasp. The chest was lined with what appeared to be oiled canvas that had protected its contents from water damage. Inside, Elena found a collection of items that looked like they belonged in a museum. There were several leather-bound books, their pages slightly yellowed but still readable. Maps drawn on heavy paper marked with symbols and notations in faded ink. And most remarkably, what appeared to be official documents bearing seals and signatures. "What is all this stuff?" Thomas whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the treasure disappear. Elena lifted out one of the books and opened it carefully. The pages were covered with handwritten entries in a neat, precise script, dates, names, numbers. It looked like some kind of record keeping. The earliest entries were dated 1883. "It's old," she said, "really old." She picked up one of the maps and spread it carefully on the ground. It showed the lake and surrounding area, but with details that didn't match what they could see now. According to the map, there had once been buildings where now there was only forest roads that no longer existed, and most intriguingly, the lake itself was shown as much smaller than it currently appeared. "Mom, look at this one." Thomas had found a document that was different from the others, more official looking, with elaborate seals and formal language. As Elena read it, her heart began to beat faster. It was some kind of transport manifest listing quantities of gold coin and bullion that had been moved through the area in 1883. The total value listed made Elena dizzy, even accounting for inflation and changes in gold prices. They were looking at a document that described treasure worth millions of dollars. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I think you really did find something important." They spent the next hour examining the contents of the chest more carefully. The story that emerged was fragmentary but tantalizing. In 1883, during the aftermath of the Civil War, someone had used Devil's Hollow as a temporary storage point for Confederate gold being moved north for sale. The operation had been secretive and apparently short-lived, but the records suggested substantial quantities of precious metals had passed through the area. More intriguingly, one of the final entries suggested that not all of the gold had successfully continued its journey north. There were references to emergency storage and temporary concealment that implied at least some of the treasure might still be hidden somewhere around the lake. As the sun set behind the mountains, Elena sat on the cabin's front porch with the chest contents spread around her like pieces of a historical jigsaw puzzle. Thomas had fallen asleep in the rocking chair beside her, exhausted by the excitement of his discovery. Looking out at the dark water of Devil's Hollow, Elena felt her life shifting around her, like the ground during an earthquake settling into new positions. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a desperate widow counting coins on a kitchen table. Now she was the owner of property that might conceal a fortune in Civil War gold. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Elena spent the night reading through the documents from the chest by lamplight, afraid to leave them unattended even for the hours she should have been sleeping. The story they told was more complex than she'd first realized, woven through with half-completed sentences and references to events she didn't understand. The man who'd kept these records, someone identified only as J. Morrison, transport coordinator, had been methodical in his documentation. Every movement of gold was noted. Every transaction recorded with the precision of someone who understood the deadly consequences of losing track of valuable cargo during wartime. But the final entries, dated in late October 1883, told a different story. Morrison's handwriting became hurried, the entries shorter and more cryptic. References to federal attention and compromised routes suggested the operation had attracted unwanted notice. The last entry was dated October 31st, 1883, and consisted of a single line, "Emergency protocols activated. God help us all." When Thomas woke the next morning, he found Elena still at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups. "Did you figure out where the treasure is?" he asked, climbing into her lap with the casual affection of a child who'd never doubted his mother could solve any puzzle. "I think we need to do some research first," Elena said, breathing in the scent of sleep-warm little boy hair. "These documents mention people and places we don't know about. Maybe we can find more information in town." Their first stop was the Fairmont Public Library, a brick building that looked like it had been built during the Depression and maintained with love, but limited funds ever since. Elena had hoped to find local historical records, but she hadn't expected to discover Martha Harrison. Martha was the head librarian, a woman in her 70s with steel gray hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When Elena approached the reference desk with Thomas in tow, Martha looked up from her cataloging with the expression of someone delighted to have actual patrons on a Wednesday morning. "We're looking for information about local history," Elena said, "specifically about mining operations in Hancock County during the 1880s. Martha's expression shifted slightly, not unwelcoming, but suddenly more attentive. "That's quite specific. Are you working on some kind of research project? We inherited some property near here, Devil's Hollow, and we found some old documents that reference mining activity from that period." Now Martha was definitely paying attention. She glanced at Thomas, who was exploring the children's section with the focused intensity he brought to all new environments. Then back to Elena. Devil's Hollow, Martha said quietly. That's the old Stone place. You knew my husband's Uncle Gregory Stone. Came in here maybe twice a year for 20 years, always looking for the same things, geological surveys, mining, records, anything related to the Civil War period around the lake. Martha leaned forward slightly. May I ask what kind of documents you found? Elena hesitated. The rational part of her knew she should be cautious about revealing too much to strangers. But Martha had the kind of face that invited confidences, and Elena had been carrying the weight of Thomas's discovery alone for too long. Transport records from 1883. They mentioned gold being moved through the area. Martha nodded slowly as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. Would you like to see what we have in our local history collection? Some of it might provide context for your documents. The local history section occupied a corner of the library's main floor, housed in filing cabinets and bound volumes that looked like they'd been compiled by generations of dedicated amateur historians. Martha pulled out several folders and spread them across a nearby table. The late 19th century was a complicated time in this part of West Virginia, Martha said. The Civil War had ended, but there were still plenty of people moving money and valuables around the country trying to rebuild their lives. Some of it was legitimate business. Some of it wasn't. She opened one of the folders and showed Elena a hand-drawn map of the region as it had appeared in the 1880s. This area was much more populated then. There were mining camps, timber operations, small communities that disappeared when the resources played out. Elena compared the library's map to the one from the chest. The geography matched, but the level of human activity was dramatically different. Where now there was only forest, the 1880s map showed roads, buildings, active mining claims. What happened to all of these places? Economic collapse mostly. When the easy coal played out and the timber was harvested, people moved on to better opportunities. Nature has a way of reclaiming abandoned places pretty quickly in these mountains. Martha pulled out another folder, this one containing newspaper clippings from the period. Elena read headlines about mine accidents, labor disputes, and occasional stories about mysterious strangers moving through the area with unknown purposes. There were always rumors about treasure hunters, Martha said. During the Civil War, a lot of wealthy families buried their valuables rather than risk losing them to occupying armies. After the war, fortune hunters came through regularly following maps and stories that were usually worthless, but occasionally led to something real. Thomas appeared at Elena's elbow, having exhausted the children's section's possibilities. Mom, look at this book I found. He was carrying a slim volume titled Ghost Stories and Local Legends of Hancock County. Elena started to redirect him towards something more age-appropriate, but Martha intervened. That's actually quite relevant to what you're researching. Local folklore often preserves historical facts that didn't make it into official records. Elena opened the book and found a chapter devoted to Devil's Hollow. The account was written in the breathless style of local ghost stories, but the basic facts aligned with what she'd learned from the transport records. According to the legend, a group of men had attempted to hide Confederate gold at the lake in 1883. Federal agents had tracked them to the area, leading to a confrontation that left several men dead and the gold's location lost. Local residents had avoided the lake ever since, believing it to be cursed by the violence that had occurred there. How much of this is true? Elena asked. Martha smiled. Probably more than you'd expect. These stories get embellished over time, but they usually start with real events. And I can tell you that Gregory Stone believed there was something to find out there. He spent decades researching the same period you're asking about. As they prepared to leave the library, Martha walked them to the door with a thoughtful expression. Mrs. Winters, she said quietly, if you do find anything significant, please be careful who you tell about it. There are people around here who've been looking for that gold a lot longer than you have. Not all of them have good intentions. Driving home, Elena found herself checking the rearview mirror more often than usual. Martha's warning had been gently delivered, but there was something in the older woman's tone that suggested she knew more than she'd shared. That evening, as Elena tucked Thomas into bed, he looked up at her with serious eyes. Mom, I had another dream about the lake. What kind of dream? There were men with shovels digging holes by the water, and they were scared. Really, really scared. Thomas pulled his blanket up to his chin. I think they buried something and then couldn't find it again. Elena kissed his forehead, but Martha's words echoed in her mind as she turned off the lights. Some secrets, it seemed, had been waiting a very long time to be discovered. The discovery came 3 days later, purely by accident. Elena had been sweeping the cabin's front porch when one of the floorboards gave way beneath her broom, revealing a gap that shouldn't have existed. When she pried up the damaged board to assess the repair needed, she found something that made her heart race. Hidden in the space between the floor joists was a wrapped package carefully sealed in oiled cloth and tucked away from moisture and curious eyes. Inside the cloth was a leather journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. The first page contained an inscription in handwriting she was beginning to recognize. Property of Gregory Stone. Private Thoughts and Observations. 1985-2024. Elena settled into Uncle Gregory's rocking chair and began to read. The journal revealed a man obsessed. For nearly 40 years, Gregory had been systematically searching for the gold that Morrison's transport records suggested was still hidden somewhere around Devil's Hollow. His entries documented decades of careful exploration, failed excavations, and growing certainty that he was close to solving a puzzle that had frustrated him since his youth. March 15, 95. Spent 6 hours with the metal detector along the North Shore. Strong readings 15 feet out from the Big Oak, but the water's too deep for me to investigate properly. Need to find a way to work underwater. September 3, 2001. The Morrison documents make more sense now. The emergency protocols he mentions weren't about hiding the gold from the Federals. They were about hiding it from Morrison's own men. Someone was planning to steal the shipment. June 12, 2010. Martha Harrison brought me more newspaper clippings from 1883. 3 bodies were found in the woods 5 miles north of here in November of that year. All shot, no identification. But the timing matches Morrison's final entries perfectly. As Elena read deeper into the journal, a disturbing pattern emerged. Gregory hadn't been the only person searching for the lost gold. Over the years, others had come to Devil's Hollow, following the same historical trail, asking the same questions, looking for the same buried treasure. July 20th, 2018. The Blackwood boy came around again today, more aggressive this time, demanding I share what I know about his family's rightful property. Told him same thing I've told his father and grandfather. The gold belongs to anybody. It belongs to whoever finds it first. But I'm starting to think these visits aren't random. They know something I don't. November 5, 2020. Found tire tracks near the South Trail this morning. Someone's been watching the place. Need to be more careful about when I do my searching. Starting to think maybe I should have told someone about what I found, just in case. The final entries were recent, dated just months before Uncle Gregory's death. His handwriting had become shakier, but his determination hadn't wavered. January 2024, the underwater metal detector readings are getting stronger. Whatever's down there is big, and it's definitely metal. Problem is it's in about 12 feet of water, and I'm too old to be diving. Maybe it's time to bring in help. February 4th, 2024. Tried to call that diving service in Morgantown, but hung up before they answered. How do you explain what you're looking for without sounding like a crazy old man? And what happens when word gets out that there's actually something worth finding here? March 3rd, 2024. Someone broke into the cabin while I was in town. Nothing obvious taken, but things were moved around. They were looking for something specific. The Morrison documents, probably. Good thing I keep them in the lake chest. Elena's blood went cold as she read the final entry. March 15th, 2024. Victor Blackwood came by today with 2 men I didn't recognize. Not a friendly visit. They made it clear they think the gold belongs to them by right of inheritance. Blackwood claims his great-great-grandfather was Morrison's business partner, says he has documents proving it. Gave me 2 weeks to come to a reasonable arrangement, or they'll take steps to protect their interests. Starting to think this inheritance I plan to leave to David's family might be more dangerous than valuable. Maybe I should destroy everything and let the secret die with me. The journal ended there. According to the lawyer's timeline, Uncle Gregory had died in a car accident just 3 days after writing that final entry. Elena sat in the gathering dusk, trying to process what she'd learned. Uncle Gregory hadn't died because of bad weather or old age. He died because someone wanted what he'd spent 40 years trying to find, the same something that was now legally hers. Mom. She looked up to find Thomas standing in the cabin doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. I had another dream about the man who used to live here. Elena patted her lap and Thomas climbed up into the rocking chair with her. What kind of dream? He was scared. Really scared. There were bad men coming to take something that didn't belong to them. Thomas looked out at the dark water of the lake. He hid things so they wouldn't find them. But he wanted someone good to find them later. Elena hugged her son closer, feeling the weight of secrets that seemed to grow heavier with each revelation. Thomas, tomorrow we're going to start being more careful about who we talk to and what we tell people. Okay, because of the treasure, because some treasures come with dangers. That night, Elena lay awake listening to the sounds of the forest around them. Every snapping branch, every rustle of leaves made her tense with the possibility that Victor Blackwood and his associates might be out there in the darkness watching and waiting. Around midnight, she heard the distinctive sound of a car engine idling somewhere along the dirt road that led to their property. The sound lasted maybe 10 minutes before fading away, but it was enough to convince Elena that Uncle Gregory's fears had been well-founded. They were no longer alone at Devil's Hollow. The next morning, Elena made two decisions that would shape everything that followed. First, she moved the Morrison documents from the chest to a new hiding place inside the cabin, where they'd be safer from both moisture and uninvited visitors. Second, she drove to town and bought the biggest, most reliable lock she could find for the cabin's front door. At the hardware store, the elderly clerk looked at her purchase with interest. Planning to lock up something valuable, Elena met his gaze steadily. Planning to keep out something dangerous. The clerk nodded as if this made perfect sense. You're the new owner of the stone place, aren't you? Word gets around fast in a small town. Word about what? About folks asking questions. Someone was in here yesterday wanting to know if you'd bought any mining equipment lately. Metal detectors, diving gear, that sort of thing. The clerk handed her the lock and her change. Told them it wasn't any of my business what my customers buy, but you might want to know that people are taking an interest. Driving home. Elena checked her rearview mirror constantly and took a longer route that would make it harder for anyone to follow her directly to the lake. But as she turned onto the dirt road that led to Devil's Hollow, she saw fresh tire tracks in the mud tracks that definitely hadn't been there that morning. Someone had been at their home while they were away. Elena's hands shook as she unlocked the cabin door, grateful now for the sturdy lock she'd installed. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance, but she'd lived in the space long enough to notice subtle differences. The kitchen chair wasn't quite pushed under the table the way she'd left it. One of the books on Uncle Gregory's shelf was turned backward. Someone had been inside searching carefully, but not carefully enough. Stay close to me, she whispered to Thomas as they moved through the cabin room by room. The Morrison documents were still safe in their new hiding place behind the loose stone in the fireplace. But Elena knew their security was an illusion. If someone was determined enough to break in, once they'd do it again. That evening, she made a decision that surprised herself. Instead of running, which every maternal instinct screamed at her to do, she decided to fight back with information. If people were willing to commit crimes to find Uncle Gregory's treasure, then the treasure was real and substantial. And if it was real, she owed it to Thomas to claim what was rightfully theirs. But she needed help. Her first night searches of the lake were clumsy affairs conducted by flashlight, while Thomas slept inside the locked cabin. Elena had never been comfortable in deep water, but desperation gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. Using Uncle Gregory's notes as a guide, she waded into the dark water with a long stick, probing the lake bottom for the metal objects his detector had identified. The water was shockingly cold, even in late spring, and the muddy bottom sucked at her boots with every step. More than once she lost her footing and nearly fell into water over her head. But on her third night of searching, her stick struck something that rang with the distinctive sound of metal against metal. The object was too large and too deeply buried for her to excavate alone, but its location matched perfectly with Uncle Gregory's most recent notes. Whatever was down there, it was exactly where he'd expected to find it. "Mom, what are you doing?" Elena spun around to find Thomas standing at the water's edge in his pajamas, looking at her with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "You should be asleep, baby. I heard you moving around outside. Are you looking for the treasure without me?" Elena waded back to shore, dripping and shivering. "I was just checking something. It's dangerous to do this in the dark. But you found something, didn't you? I can tell by your face." Thomas had always been able to read her emotions with uncanny accuracy. Elena wrapped him in the towel she'd brought and pulled him close. "Maybe. But we need help to find out for sure." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Elena was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard footsteps on the front porch. Through the window, she saw a man in his 60s examining the documents she'd left scattered on the kitchen table. Documents that contained just enough real information to be intriguing, but not enough to reveal their most important secrets. "Can I help you?" Elena asked, stepping through the front door with what she hoped was confident authority. The man straightened with the easy movement of someone accustomed to being caught in places he wasn't supposed to be. He was tall and lean with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His clothes suggested someone who spent time outdoors but wasn't afraid of getting dirty. "Mrs. Winters, I'm Michael Reed. I teach local history at the community college in Fairmont." He gestured toward the papers on the table. "Martha Harrison mentioned you'd found some interesting documents related to Civil War-era activity in this area." Elena studied his face, trying to gauge whether he represented help or another threat. "What kind of interests do you have in Civil War history, Professor Reed?" "The academic kind, mostly. But I'll admit I've always been curious about the stories surrounding this particular location." Michael glanced around the cabin with obvious familiarity. "I knew Gregory Stone fairly well. We shared an interest in local historical mysteries." How well Michael's expression became more serious. "Well enough that he called me 2 weeks before he died. He said he'd found something important and wanted a historian's opinion about how to handle it properly. We were supposed to meet the day after his accident." Elena felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align. "What did he tell you about what he'd found?" "Nothing specific over the phone. But Gregory had been researching the same historical period for decades, and based on what I can see here." Michael gestured toward the papers. "I think he finally found what he was looking for." Thomas appeared from the back bedroom where Elena had told him to stay while she dealt with their visitor. He walked directly to Michael with the fearless curiosity that made Elena's heart race with protective anxiety. "Are you here about the treasure?" Thomas asked. Michael knelt down to Thomas's eye level. "What treasure is that?" "The gold that's buried under the lake. Mom and I found the maps that show where it is." Elena started to intervene, but Michael held up a gentle hand. "That's very exciting. Have you found any of the gold yet?" "Not yet, but Mom's been looking at night when she thinks I'm asleep." Thomas glanced at Elena with a grin that was part apology, part conspiracy. "I think she found something big." Michael stood and looked at Elena with new respect. "Mrs. Winters, I think we need to have a serious conversation about what you've discovered and what it might mean for your safety." Over the next hour, Michael revealed the depth of his knowledge about the historical events surrounding Devil's Hollow. He confirmed most of what Elena had pieced together from Uncle Gregory's research and added crucial details that put the mystery in clearer focus. The Morrison transport operation was more sophisticated than most people realize, Michael explained, and as they sat on the cabin's porch, Thomas listening intently beside them. They weren't just moving random Confederate gold north for sale. They were liquidating the treasury reserves of several prominent Southern families trying to rebuild after the war. "How much money are we talking about in 1883 dollars?" Michael's eyes narrowed in calculation. "In terms of purchasing power back then, probably around $50,000. In today's value, and assuming the transport manifests were accurate and the gold actually made it to this location, you're looking at something close to $2 million. He pulled out a folder he'd brought with him. It contained photocopies of newspaper articles, court records, and other official documents collected over years of research. The picture they painted was of a criminal enterprise that had attracted attention from federal authorities and competing treasure hunters alike. The Blackwood family has legitimate historical claims to at least part of whatever Morrison was transporting. Victor Blackwood's great-great-grandfather was Morrison's business partner in several ventures. But their claim is complicated by the fact that Morrison apparently tried to cut the Blackwoods out of the final operation. So they're not just random treasure hunters. Michael's expression grew darker. No, they've been searching for this gold for 4 generations. And they're not the only ones with historical ties to the story. Mrs. Winters Gregory's death wasn't an accident. I can't prove it, but I'm certain of it. Someone killed him to prevent him from recovering that treasure. Elena felt the familiar chill of fear tempered now by something stronger. "Professor Reed, if we found the gold, how would we go about claiming it legally?" "Very carefully and with lots of documentation. Treasure hunting law is complicated, especially when there are competing historical claims. But if you can prove the gold was abandoned property on land, you legally own, you'd have a strong case. Thomas had been listening to their conversation with the intense concentration he brought to subjects that captured his imagination. Now he looked up at Michael with serious eyes. Would you help us find it? Mom needs someone who knows about the old stuff, and I think the lake wants us to find what's hidden there. Michael glanced at Elena, then back at Thomas. What makes you think the lake wants you to find anything? It talks to me, not with words, but I can feel where the important things are buried. Elena expected Michael to dismiss Thomas's claim with adult skepticism. Instead, the professor nodded thoughtfully. Some people are sensitive to things others can't perceive. If you really can sense where things are hidden, that would make our search much more efficient. That evening, after Michael left with promises to return the next day with more specialized equipment, Elena sat on the porch watching Thomas skip stones across the dark water of Devil's Hollow. For the first time since inheriting Uncle Gregory's burden, she felt they had a real chance of success. But she also understood with crystal clarity that they were running out of time. Victor Blackwood and his associates wouldn't wait much longer before taking more direct action. The treasure hunt was about to become a race. Michael returned the next morning, carrying equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. The underwater metal detector was sleek and modern, a far cry from the simple handheld device Uncle Gregory had used for his searches. More importantly, Michael brought diving gear that would allow them to investigate the lakebed properly. Where did you get all this? Elena asked as Michael unpacked his equipment on the cabin's front porch. The college has an archaeology program. Technically, this is research into local historical sites. Michael's smile was slightly sheepish. I may have bent the truth a little about our specific objectives, but everything we're doing is academically legitimate. While Michael set up the metal detector, Elena discovered another of Uncle Gregory's secrets. Hidden behind a false back in the bedroom closet was a collection of equipment that revealed the true scope of his treasure hunting efforts. There were underwater cameras, diving masks, waterproof containers, and most surprisingly, a complete set of breathing apparatus that looked like it had been maintained with military precision. Your uncle was more prepared than I realized, Michael said when Elena showed him what she'd found. This is professional-grade diving equipment. He must have been planning a major underwater operation. Thomas examined the diving gear with the fascination of a child who'd never seen anything more exciting. Can I try it on? Absolutely not, Elena said immediately. This is dangerous equipment for experienced adults only. But as Michael began his systematic survey of the lake with the metal detector, it became clear that Thomas's input would be crucial to their success. The boy seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of the lake's geography that neither Elena nor Michael could match. Try over there, Thomas said, pointing to a section of water that looked identical to everywhere else they'd searched. There's something big under the mud in that spot. Michael moved the detector to the indicated area and immediately got strong readings. How did you know that? Thomas shrugged. It feels different, like there's something important waiting. Over the course of the morning, Thomas directed Michael to 3 locations where the metal detector registered significant buried objects. Each site was in water between 8 and 12 feet deep, too deep for casual investigation, but accessible to someone with proper diving equipment. We're going to need to go down there, Michael said, as they took a break for lunch. The detector can tell us something's there, but we need visual confirmation before we start any major recovery operation. Elena looked at the dark water with familiar dread. She'd never been a strong swimmer, and the thought of diving into the murky depths of Devil's Hollow filled her with anxiety that bordered on panic. I can't do it, she said quietly. I'm sorry, but I just can't go down there. I can. Michael said, I've been diving for 20 years. It's not that dangerous if you know what you're doing. They spent the afternoon preparing for Michael's descent. Elena studied the underwater cameras while Michael checked and rechecked his breathing equipment. Thomas helped by pointing out additional areas of interest that he thought might be worth investigating. Remember, Elena said as Michael prepared to enter the water? We're just looking today. Don't try to move anything heavy by yourself. Michael nodded and slipped beneath the surface with the controlled grace of an experienced diver. Through the underwater camera's display, Elena and Thomas watched as he descended toward the lakebed, following the metal detector's guidance toward their first target. What Michael found exceeded their most optimistic expectations. Buried in the lakebed, partially covered by decades of accumulated sediment, was a collection of metal containers that matched exactly the descriptions in Morrison's transport manifests. There were strong boxes, sealed barrels, and what appeared to be a large safe that had been deliberately weighted down and submerged. "There's got to be 20 separate containers down here," Michael's voice crackled through the surface communication system. "Some of them are small enough to bring up by hand, but that safe is going to require serious equipment." As Michael documented each find with the underwater camera, Elena felt a mixture of excitement and growing apprehension. They'd found the treasure, there was no doubt about that now, but the sheer quantity of hidden wealth raised questions about how they were going to recover it safely and legally. Their planning session was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the dirt road. Elena looked up to see two pickup trucks bouncing toward the cabin, carrying more passengers than any friendly visit would require. "Michael, get out of the water," Elena called into the communication system. "We have company." The truck stopped in front of the cabin, and 6 men climbed out with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd worked together before. The man leading the group was tall and imposing with graying hair, and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. "Mrs. Winters, I'm Victor Blackwood. I believe we need to have a conversation." Elena stepped protectively in front of Thomas while mentally cataloging the equipment scattered around their makeshift work area. There was no way to hide what they'd been doing. The metal detector, diving gear, and underwater cameras made their activities obvious. "Mr. Blackwood, I was wondering when you'd introduce yourself." Victor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I apologize for not visiting sooner. I wanted to give you time to settle in and discover the reality of your situation." He gestured toward the lake. "I see you've been making progress." "I don't know what you mean. Mrs. Winters, my family has been researching this site for over a century. We know exactly what's down there, and we know you found it." Victor's tone remained conversational, but his companions had positioned themselves to block any escape routes. "The question is whether we can reach a mutually beneficial arrangement." Michael surfaced at the edge of the lake, immediately recognizing the tension in the situation. He swam toward shore with deliberate calm, not wanting to provoke a confrontation while Elena and Thomas were exposed. "Professor Reed." Victor nodded in acknowledgement. "I should have expected you'd become involved eventually. Your reputation for historical research is well known in certain circles." Michael replied, climbing out of the water with careful dignity. "I was wondering when you'd resort to intimidation tactics." "This isn't intimidation, Michael. This is a business proposition." Victor pulled out a folder and handed it to Elena. "These documents establish my family's legal claim to any precious metals recovered from this site. Morrison was transporting gold that belonged to my great-great-grandfather's mining consortium." Elena opened the folder and found herself looking at what appeared to be legitimate 19th century contracts and partnership agreements. The papers were old, properly preserved, and bore official seals that looked authentic. "Even if these documents are real, this is my property. Whatever's buried here belongs to me." "That's where you were wrong," Victor said. "Mineral rights and surface rights are different things, and in this case, the mineral rights, including any precious metals deposited on the property, belong to the Blackwood Mining Trust." Thomas had been listening to the conversation with the serious attention he gave to all adult conflicts that affected their family. Now he stepped forward with the fearless directness that sometimes made Elena's heart stop. "You're lying. Uncle Gregory's ghost told me the bad men would come and try to steal what doesn't belong to them." Victor stared at Thomas with surprise that quickly shifted to something more calculating. "What exactly did Uncle Gregory's ghost tell you?" Son Elena started to intervene, but Thomas was already answering with the honesty that made him vulnerable and powerful in equal measure. "He said the gold belongs to whoever finds it first, and he said the bad men killed him because he wouldn't tell them where it was hidden." Thomas looked directly at Victor with 7-year-old fearlessness. "He said you're the bad man." The silence that followed was broken by the distinctive sound of Martha Harrison's car coming up the dirt road. Elena had never been so grateful to see the elderly librarian, who climbed out of her vehicle with the determined air of someone arriving to settle a dispute. "Victor Blackwood," Martha said without preamble, "you and your boys need to get off this property before I call the sheriff." Victor's confident demeanor flickered for the first time. "Martha, this is a private business matter. This is harassment, and we both know it." Martha walked directly to Elena's side with the protective instincts of a grandmother defending her family. "Mrs. Winters, I brought you something I think you need to see." She handed Elena an envelope that felt heavy with official papers. Gregory gave me this 2 weeks before he died. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure his heir got these documents. Elena opened the envelope and found herself holding what appeared to be a will and several legal documents that had been notarized and witnessed. According to the papers, Uncle Gregory had specifically bequeathed all mineral rights associated with his property to his heir, along with any archaeological or historical discoveries made on the land. It seems Martha said with satisfaction that Gregory anticipated your family's interest in his property, Victor, and he took steps to ensure his wishes would be legally protected. Victor's expression had turned cold, but he gestured to his companions and they began moving back toward their trucks. This isn't over, Mrs. Winters. My family's rights go back a lot further than Gregory Stone's will. As the trucks disappeared down the dirt road, Elena felt the weight of escalation settling around them like storm clouds. They'd found the treasure, established their legal right to claim it, and made enemies who weren't going to give up easily. The race was about to become a war. The revelation came from an unexpected source. 3 days later, Elena was in town buying supplies when she noticed a black sedan that had been following her since she left the hardware store. Instead of driving directly home, she took a circuitous route through Fairmont's residential neighborhoods, confirming her suspicions when the sedan maintained its distance through several unnecessary turns. Rather than leading potential threats back to Thomas and Michael, Elena parked at the police station and waited. The sedan drove past without stopping, but not before she got a clear look at the driver, one of Victor Blackwood's associates from their unpleasant visit. Inside the police station, Elena found herself face-to-face with Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man in his 50s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with mountain people and their complicated family disputes. Mrs. Winters, he said after she'd explained the situation, I'm familiar with the Blackwood family and their various business interests. They've been involved in legal disputes over mining claims for as long as I've been wearing this badge. Are they dangerous? Sheriff Bradley chose his words carefully. They're persistent and they have resources that most people around here don't. But they've always stayed on the legal side of their disagreements. He paused. Mostly. What does mostly mean? It means there have been incidents over the years involving people who got in the way of their treasure hunting activities. Nothing I could ever prove but enough to make me pay attention when their name comes up. Elena left the police station with Sheriff Bradley's business card and a promise that he'd increase patrols around Devil's Hollow. But she also left with the uncomfortable knowledge that local law enforcement was limited in what they could do about Victor Blackwood's intimidation tactics. She was driving home when her cell phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. Mrs. Winters, this is Victor Blackwood. I think we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. Elena pulled over to the side of the road, her heart racing. How did you get this number? Small town Mrs. Winters? People talk. Victor's voice was calm, reasonable. I'd like to propose a meeting. Just you and me. No lawyers or associates. I think we can reach an understanding that benefits everyone. I'm not interested in any deals. You should be because I have information you need to know before you continue your treasure hunting activities. Information about the real ownership of that gold. Against her better judgment, Elena found herself listening. The Morrison transport operation wasn't what you think it was, Victor continued, and neither was my family's involvement. Meet me at the Fairmont Diner in an hour, and I'll show you documents that will change how you think about this entire situation. Elena sat in her parked car for 10 minutes after the call ended, weighing her options. Every instinct told her not to trust Victor Blackwood. But if he had information that could affect their legal claim to the treasure, she needed to know what it was. The Fairmont Diner was busy with the early dinner crowd when Elena arrived. She found Victor sitting in a corner booth dressed in casual clothes that made him look more like a college professor than a potential threat. A manila folder sat on the table between them. Thank you for coming, Victor said as Elena slid into the opposite side of the booth. I know this situation has been stressful for you. Get to the point, Mr. Blackwood. Victor opened the folder and spread out several documents that looked genuinely old and official. These are the original partnership agreements between Morrison and my great-great-grandfather Samuel Blackwood. As you can see, they established the Blackwood Mining Trust as equal partners in all transport and storage operations. Elena examined the papers. Unlike the documents she'd seen before, these had the detailed complexity of legitimate business contracts. They specified profit-sharing arrangements. territorial responsibilities, and most importantly, joint ownership of any precious metals held in temporary storage. This still doesn't give you rights to property I legally inherited. Actually, it does. Victor pulled out another document, this one more recent, bearing county seals and legal stamps. Mineral rights in this county are governed by 19th century mining law. When Morrison and my ancestor established their partnership, they filed claims that supersede any subsequent property transfers. Elena felt her confidence wavering as she studied the legal filing. It appeared to establish the Blackwood Mining Trust as the legal owner of any precious metals discovered on a large tract of land that included Devil's Hollow. Why are you showing me this? Because I don't want a legal battle that could take years to resolve and cost both of us a fortune in attorney fees. I'm prepared to offer you a partnership arrangement. Victor leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine sincerity. 50-50 split of whatever we recover. You provide access to the property. I provide the legal protection and resources needed for a major recovery operation. Elena studied Victor's face, looking for signs of deception. What happened to Uncle Gregory? Victor's expression became more serious. Gregory was a stubborn old man who refused to listen to reason. He thought he could keep the location of the gold secret and recover it himself. That was never realistic. Did you kill him, Mrs. Winters? I'm a businessman, not a murderer. Gregory died in a car accident because he was driving too fast on dangerous mountain roads in bad weather. Victor gathered up his documents. But his death was a tragedy that could have been avoided if he'd been willing to work with us instead of against us. Elena left the diner with more questions than answers and a business card with Victor's direct phone number. The partnership offer was tempting. 50% of $2 million was still life-changing money, and it would eliminate the legal uncertainties that made her treasure-hunting activities risky. But when she arrived back at Devil's Hollow, she found Michael and Thomas in animated conversation about their latest underwater discoveries. Mom Thomas ran to greet her with the excitement of a child who'd been holding back important news. Michael found the really big box, the one I told him was the most important. Michael emerged from the cabin with photos from his latest dive. Elena, you need to see this. We found Morrison's primary cache, and it's exactly where Thomas said it would be. The underwater photographs showed a large metal strongbox partially buried in the lake bed. Unlike the smaller containers they'd found earlier, this one bore official markings that were still visible despite decades underwater. Can you read what it says? Elena asked. Michael pointed to lettering stamped into the metal. Confederate States Treasury, Richmond Reserve, 1863. Elena stared at the photographs. This isn't private gold being transported for sale. This is actual Confederate government treasure, which changes everything. Government treasure has different legal status than private property, Michael said. And if this box contains what I think it does, we're looking at a discovery of significant historical importance. Elena told Michael about her meeting with Victor Blackwood and the documents he'd shown her. Michael listened with growing concern, particularly when she described the mining claims that seemed to establish Blackwood ownership of mineral rights. Elena, I need to tell you something I should have mentioned earlier. Michael sat down heavily in Uncle Gregory's rocking chair. I wasn't entirely honest about my relationship with your uncle. Elena felt a familiar chill of apprehension. What do you mean Gregory and I weren't just academic colleagues? We were partners. He provided access to the property and historical research. I provided diving expertise and historical authentication. We agreed to split whatever we found 50-50. The betrayal hit Elena like a physical blow. You've been lying to me this entire time. Not lying, just not telling you the whole truth. Michael's expression was genuinely remorseful. But Gregory's death changed everything. When he died, our partnership died with him. I had no legal claim to anything he discovered. So you decided to manipulate his heirs instead. I decided to honor my friend's memory by helping his family claim what was rightfully theirs. Michael leaned forward. Elena Gregory specifically told me that if anything happened to him, I should make sure his inheritance went to people who would use it responsibly. He was terrified that the Blackwoods would eventually find the treasure and use it for purposes he couldn't support. What purposes? Michael hesitated, then pulled out his own folder of documents. The Blackwood family isn't just interested in the gold for its monetary value. They're part of a larger organization that's been collecting Confederate artifacts and treasure for decades. Their ultimate goal is to fund a museum and cultural center dedicated to what they call Southern Heritage Preservation. Elena looked at the documents. Michael handed her photographs of Victor Blackwood at various events, newspaper clippings about controversial monuments, and historical displays, financial records showing connections to organizations that promoted revisionist Civil War history. They want to use Confederate gold to fund Confederate propaganda, she said. That's exactly what Gregory was afraid of. He spent 40 years searching for that treasure because he believed it belonged in a legitimate museum where it could be studied and displayed in proper historical context. As Elena absorbed these revelations, Thomas appeared on the porch with his serious expression that meant he'd been thinking about adult problems. Mom, the lake is telling me we need to get the treasure out soon. Something bad is coming. Elena looked at her son, then at Michael, then at the photographs of Confederate gold sitting 12 feet below the surface of Devil's Hollow. Michael, how long would it take to recover the main strongbox? With proper equipment, maybe 6 hours of careful work. Elena made a decision that surprised herself. Then we're going to do it tomorrow night, before Victor Blackwood decides that business partnerships aren't worth the trouble. As the sun set behind the mountains, Elena sat on the porch watching Thomas skip stones across the dark water. Tomorrow they would either secure their future or lose everything in the attempt. But for the first time since inheriting Uncle Gregory's burden, she felt like they were fighting for something more important than money. They were fighting for the right to determine how history would be remembered. Elena spent the night studying Uncle Gregory's diving equipment with the methodical attention of someone whose life might depend on understanding every detail. The gear was older than what Michael used, but it had been maintained with meticulous care. More importantly, it was designed for the specific conditions of Devil's Hollow, the cold water, limited visibility, and challenging bottom terrain that had claimed so many previous treasure hunting attempts. Are you sure about this? Michael asked as Elena practiced with the breathing apparatus in the shallow water near shore. I can handle the recovery operation myself. 2 divers working together will be faster and safer than one working alone, Elena replied, though her voice shook slightly as she adjusted the mask. And if something goes wrong down there, Thomas needs both of us to come back up. The truth was more complicated than Elena was willing to admit. After learning about Michael's original partnership with Uncle Gregory, she didn't trust anyone else to have exclusive access to the treasure. If she was going to risk everything on one desperate recovery attempt, she needed to be personally involved in every aspect of the operation. Thomas had appointed himself mission coordinator, a role he approached with the serious dedication of a child who understood the importance of what they were attempting. He'd spent the morning creating detailed maps of the lake bottom based on his intuitive understanding of where things were hidden. The big box is here, he said, pointing to a spot on his hand-drawn chart. But there are smaller things buried around it that you should get too, like they were all hidden at the same time. Michael compared Thomas's map to his own underwater survey notes and found them remarkably accurate. How do you know where things are without going down there yourself? Thomas shrugged with the casual acceptance of a child who'd never doubted his own perceptions. The lake shows me. It wants the old things to come up into the light again. Their planning was interrupted by a phone call from Martha Harrison. Her voice was tense with worry when Elena answered. Elena, you need to know that Victor Blackwood was at the library this morning with 2 men I didn't recognize. They were looking through county records and asking questions about diving permits and underwater salvage regulations. What kind of questions? The kind that suggested they're planning their own recovery operation very soon. And Elena, one of the men had a gun. I could see it under his jacket when he reached for a book. Elena felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. Did they say anything about timing? They were asking about county regulations for weekend excavation permits. I think they're planning to move tomorrow night. After Martha hung up, Elena shared the information with Michael and watched his expression grow grave. If they're bringing armed men to a treasure recovery operation, they're not planning to honor any legal agreements. We need to move tonight, or we're going to lose our chance entirely. Elena looked at Thomas, who was listening to their conversation with the intense attention he brought to all adult crises that affected their family. Baby, I need you to understand something. What we're going to do tonight is dangerous. Nothing's going to go wrong, Thomas said with the confident certainty of childhood. The lake wants us to find the treasure. It's been waiting for the right people to come along. As the sun set behind the mountains, Elena and Michael made their final preparations. They checked and rechecked their diving equipment, tested their underwater communication system, and reviewed their plan for bringing the heavy strongbox to the surface using inflatable lifting bags that Michael had borrowed from the college's archaeology department. The most dangerous part will be the initial excavation, Michael explained, as they suited up in their diving gear. That strongbox has been buried for over a century. The sediment around it is going to be packed hard and will have limited visibility while we're digging. Elena nodded, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The thought of working in the dark water 12 feet below the surface made her heart race with anxiety that bordered on panic. But the alternative, letting Victor Blackwood and his armed associates claim the treasure, was worse than her fear. Mom Thomas appeared at her side as she pulled on her diving mask. "Uncle Gregory wants me to tell you something." Elena knelt down to Thomas's eye level. "What does he want you to tell me?" "He says to look for the metal box with his initials on it. It's got something inside that will help you prove the treasure belongs to us." Thomas's expression was completely serious. "And he says to be careful of the bad men who might come tonight." Elena hugged her son close, breathing in the familiar scent of little boy hair and childhood innocence. "I love you, baby. No matter what happens tonight, remember that everything I'm doing is to give you a better life. I know, Mom, and the lake knows too." Michael had positioned himself at the water's edge with the underwater lights and lifting equipment. The plan was straightforward: descend to the main cache site, excavate the Confederate strongbox and any smaller containers they could locate, attach the lifting bags, and bring everything to the surface before Victor Blackwood's people arrived. "Communication check," Michael said into his headset as Elena waded into the cold water. "I can hear you clearly," Elena replied, though her voice was tight with nervousness. The descent into the dark water was every bit as terrifying as Elena had expected. Below 6 feet, the lake became a world of absolute blackness, penetrated only by their diving lights. The bottom was thick with sediment that clouded the water with every movement, and the cold seemed to seep through her wetsuit and into her bones. But as they reached the cache site, Elena felt her fear giving way to focused determination. The Confederate strongbox was exactly where Thomas had said it would be, partially buried, but clearly visible in the beam of her diving light. And scattered around it were smaller containers that matched the descriptions in Morrison's transport manifests. Starting excavation of the main target, Michael's voice crackled through the underwater communication system. Working together, they began the careful process of digging the strongbox free from decades of accumulated sediment. The work was slow and physically demanding, made more difficult by the limited visibility and the need to avoid damaging whatever was inside the sealed container. 20 minutes into the excavation, Elena's light illuminated something that made her heart race. Partially buried near the strongbox was a smaller metal container bearing the initials GS, exactly what Thomas had told her to look for. "Michael, I found something." She worked the smaller box free and opened it carefully. Inside, protected by oiled cloth, just like the original Morrison documents, was a collection of papers that appeared to be Uncle Gregory's final research notes. But these weren't the historical documents she'd expected. They were legal documents, recent legal documents. By the light of her underwater lamp, Elena read a notarized statement that made everything clear. Uncle Gregory had spent the final months of his life working with lawyers to establish an irrevocable trust that would protect any treasure discovered on his property from competing historical claims. The trust specifically excluded any organization or individual who intended to use Confederate artifacts for the promotion of divisive historical narratives or political purposes. Victor Blackwood and his Southern Heritage Foundation were legally excluded from any claim to the treasure. "Elena, we've got the strongbox free." Michael's voice interrupted her reading. "But we need to move fast. I'm seeing lights on the shore." Elena looked up toward the surface and saw what Michael had spotted: flashlight beams moving through the trees around the cabin. Victor Blackwood's people had arrived earlier than expected. "How many?" Elena asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "At least 4, maybe more. And they're setting up some kind of equipment near the water." Elena sealed Uncle Gregory's legal documents back in their container and attached it to her diving belt. Then she helped Michael position the lifting bags around the Confederate strongbox. The inflatable bags would bring the heavy container to the surface, but the process would take several minutes and create obvious disturbance in the water. "On my count," Michael said. 3, 2, 1. They activated the lifting system simultaneously. The bags inflated with compressed air, and the strongbox began its slow ascent toward the surface. But the disturbance also created a cloud of sediment that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Elena, there are men with lights at the water's edge. Thomas's voice came through their communication system from his position in the cabin. And they have guns. Elena's blood went cold. Their plan had assumed they would have time to bring the treasure to shore and secure it before anyone arrived to challenge their claim. Instead, they were trapped underwater while armed men controlled the shoreline. Michael, we need to surface away from the main landing area, Elena said. Can we come up on the far side of the lake? The equipment isn't designed for that kind of distance, and we'd be leaving the strongbox for them to claim. As if to punctuate Michael's concern, they heard the unmistakable sound of a motorboat engine starting up somewhere above them. Victor Blackwood hadn't just brought men with guns, he'd brought equipment for his own underwater recovery operation. New plan, Elena said, making a decision that surprised herself with its boldness. We surface right here, right now, and we face whatever's waiting for us on shore. Elena, that's suicide. They have weapons and we're defenseless in the water. Not defenseless, Elena replied, remembering something Uncle Gregory had written in his journal. Thomas, are you listening? I'm here, Mom. I need you to call Sheriff Bradley right now. Tell him there are armed men threatening us on our own property. Tell him we need help immediately. Already did, Thomas said with 7-year-old pride. When I saw the bad men coming through the trees, Elena and Michael surfaced together 50 feet from shore, the Confederate strongbox floating between them, supported by the lifting bags. On the shoreline, Elena could see Victor Blackwood and 5 other men, 3 of whom were clearly carrying weapons. Mrs. Winters, Victor called across the water, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. I think it's time we discuss the terms of our partnership. I don't think we have anything to discuss. Elena called back, treading water beside the treasure that represented her son's future. You're in the middle of a lake with nowhere to go, and I have 6 men on shore who are very motivated to protect my family's interests. I think we have plenty to discuss. Elena was about to respond when she heard the most beautiful sound of her life, the distant wail of police sirens growing steadily louder. Sheriff Bradley was coming and he was bringing backup. Victor Blackwood heard the sirens too. His confident demeanor flickered as he realized his intimidation tactics had just become criminal assault charges if he pressed his advantage. This isn't over, Mrs. Winters, he called across the water. Legal documents can be challenged. Trust funds can be broken. And some things are worth more than money. As the sirens grew louder, Victor and his associates melted back into the forest like shadows, leaving Elena and Michael alone in the water with $1 million worth of Civil War treasure floating between them. Mom Thomas's voice carried clearly across the dark water. Are you okay? Elena looked at the strongbox bobbing in the gentle waves, then at Michael's relieved face in the glow of their diving bites, then at the cabin where her son was waiting for them to come home safely. We're okay, baby, she called back. We're coming home. Duyan den Farroy sank with second sat Devil's Hollow. Chuyên thực hiện trường nguy hiểm thành một cuộc khám phá khảo cổ học được bảo vệ chính thức. Cảnh sát trưởng Bradley và 3 phó cảnh sát nhanh chóng bảo vệ khu vực, trong khi Elena và Michael hoàn tất việc đưa chiếc hòm lớn của liên minh lên bờ. Mrs. Winters, are you injured? Sheriff Bradley asked as Elena climbed out of the water, still wearing her diving gear. We're fine, But Victor Blackwood and his associates were here with weapons threatening us while we conducted legal archaeological recovery on our own property. Sheriff Bradley examined the Confederate strongbox with professional interest as it rested on the shore water, still streaming from its aged metal surface. The contents inside, gleaming in the flashlight beams, represented a fortune in gold coins and historical artifacts. And this is what they were after, this and several other containers we've located underwater. Civil War-era treasure that was hidden here in 1883. Elena showed him Uncle Gregory's legal documents, now safely sealed in waterproof containers. These establish our legal right to anything we recover. While the sheriff reviewed the paperwork, Michael coordinated with the deputies to retrieve the remaining containers from the lake bed. The recovery operation had transformed from a desperate midnight treasure hunt into a professionally supervised archaeological excavation. I'm going to need detailed statements from both of you, Sheriff Bradley said. But first, let's secure these artifacts. My department doesn't exactly have protocols for Confederate treasury recovery. Thomas watched from the cabin doorway, his face a mixture of excitement and lingering fear. When the immediate danger had passed, Elena wrapped him in a blanket and brought him down to see what they'd recovered. "Is that the real treasure?" Mom Thomas whispered, his eyes wide, as he stared at the strongbox. "It's real, baby. You were right all along." As dawn broke over the mountains, Elena found herself standing on the shore surrounded by more wealth than she'd ever imagined possessing. The Confederate strongbox alone contained gold coins and bullion worth over $1 million. The smaller containers held additional precious metals, historical documents, and artifacts that would be invaluable to legitimate museums and historians. But the most important discovery was in the waterproof container bearing Gregory's initials. Elena found not only the legal trust documents that protected their claim, but also a letter addressed to David's family in Uncle Gregory's careful handwriting. As Michael and the deputies cataloged the other recovered items, she read the letter aloud to Thomas. "My dear relatives," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I have passed on and you have found what I spent 40 years searching for. This treasure belongs to you by right of inheritance. But more importantly, it belongs to you because you understand what it represents." Thomas listened intently, sitting close to his mother, his eyes never leaving the paper in her hands. This gold was stolen from the people of the South during their darkest hour and hidden by men who cared more about profit than principle. It does not belong to organizations that want to use it to promote hatred or division. It belongs to people who understand that history should be preserved honestly without romanticism or revision. Elena felt a lump in her throat as she read the final lines. "Use this treasure wisely. Use it to build a better life for your children. And if anyone tries to take it from you, remember that some things are worth fighting for." Thomas's expression was solemn, far older than his 7 years. Uncle Gregory was a good man, wasn't he? "Yes, baby. He was a very good man who wanted to make sure we were taken care of." Sheriff Bradley approached them, his radio crackling with updates from his deputies who were patrolling the area for any sign of Blackwood's return. "We've got probable cause to search for Victor Blackwood based on your description of the armed confrontation. But I need you to understand something. The Blackwood family has connections throughout this county. They're going to fight your claim to this treasure with every legal resource they have." "Let them fight," Elena said, surprising herself, with the steel in her voice. "We have right on our side." The morning brought a flurry of activity. News of the discovery had somehow leaked, and by 10 o'clock, the first news vans were attempting to navigate the rough dirt road to Devil's Hollow. Sheriff Bradley stationed a deputy at the entrance to keep them at bay, while Elena and Michael secured the artifacts in a makeshift vault they created in the cabin's root cellar. By noon, Victor Blackwood arrived with his own lawyer, a tall, angular man in an expensive suit who carried a briefcase that likely cost more than all the furniture in Elena's cabin combined. "Mrs. Winters," the lawyer said as they gathered around the kitchen table, "my client is prepared to purchase your treasure claim for $2 million cash. No legal battles, no complications, no delays. You sign over your rights to the recovered materials, and you walk away with more money than most people see in a lifetime." Elena examined the contract they'd prepared. It was legitimate, generous, and would solve every financial problem she'd ever faced. Thomas would have college money. They could buy a real home in a good school district. She'd never have to worry about paying bills or working extra shifts again. "What happens to the treasure if I accept your offer?" Elena asked. "It becomes part of the Blackwood Foundation's historical collection where it will be properly preserved and displayed." Displayed how and where, the lawyer exchanged glances with Victor before answering. "As part of a comprehensive exhibition about Southern heritage and the economic impact of Northern aggression during the Reconstruction period." Elena understood immediately what that meant. The treasure would become propaganda used to promote a version of history that painted the Civil War as Northern oppression rather than a fight to end slavery. "I need time to think about your offer," Elena said. "Of course, but please understand that this is a limited time proposal." The lawyer closed his briefcase with a definitive click. "If you choose to fight our historical claims in court, the legal costs alone could consume any potential profits from your discovery." After they left, Elena sat on the porch with Thomas and Michael, watching the morning sun sparkle on the water of Devil's Hollow. $2 million was life-changing money, but accepting it would mean betraying Uncle Gregory's trust and everything he'd believed about preserving history honestly. "What do you think, baby?" Elena asked her son. "Should we take their money?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. Uncle Gregory's ghost says the treasure belongs to us, he said finally. And that means we get to decide what happens to it, not the bad men. Elena hugged her son close, drawing strength from his simple clarity. You're right, baby. It's ours to decide. Michael had been silent during this exchange, clearly not wanting to influence their decision. Now he spoke carefully. Whatever you decide, I want you to know, I'll support you. But Gregory would be proud of you for asking that question. He believed the value of this treasure went far beyond its monetary worth. Elena nodded, a plan already forming in her mind. I think it's time we called the Smithsonian. Her rejection of the Blackwood offer triggered a legal war that consumed the next 3 months. Victor Blackwood's foundation filed injunctions, historical claims, and mineral rights disputes that challenged every aspect of her ownership of the recovered treasure. But Elena had advantages that previous treasure hunters had lacked. Uncle Gregory's meticulous legal preparations provided a foundation for their case, and Martha Harrison emerged as an unexpected but powerful advocate. Her decades of experience as the county's head librarian had given her access to historical records that even the Blackwood family's lawyers couldn't match. When Victor's legal team tried to establish their great-great-grandfather's partnership with Morrison, Martha produced county records showing that the original partnership had been dissolved before the treasure was hidden. Samuel Blackwood sold his interest in the transport operation 6 months before the gold was concealed at Devil's Hollow. Martha testified during the preliminary hearing. I have the original bill of sale properly notarized and filed with the county clerk in 1883. Michael Reed proved to be more than just an academic ally. His connections in the historical preservation community brought Elena access to lawyers who specialized in archaeological law and understood the complexities of Civil War treasure recovery. His documentation of the recovery process provided the kind of detailed provenance that legitimate museums required. The key to our legal position, Elena's lawyer explained during one of their strategy sessions, is that we can prove chain of custody from the original 1883 concealment to the present day. Gregory Stone's research creates an unbroken historical record that establishes your claim beyond reasonable doubt. The legal battles were expensive and emotionally draining. Elena found herself driving to town 3 days a week for meetings with lawyers, court appearances, and depositions that required her to defend every aspect of her treasure hunting activities. The stress took a toll on both her and Thomas. Mom, why can't the bad men just leave us alone? Thomas asked one evening as Elena reviewed legal documents at the kitchen table. Because they think the treasure belongs to them and they're willing to fight for it. But Uncle Gregory said it belongs to us. Elena looked at her son's serious face and made a decision that surprised her lawyers and terrified her accountant. Thomas, what would you think if we gave some of the treasure to a museum? Not to the bad men, but to people who would take care of it properly. Would we still have enough money for college in a real house? We'd have more than enough. Thomas considered this with the careful thought he brought to all important decisions, his brow furrowed in concentration. I think Uncle Gregory would like that. He wanted the old things to be in a place where people could learn about them. Over the following weeks, Elena worked with Dr. Sarah Chen from the Smithsonian to arrange the donation of half the recovered treasure to the museum. The decision transformed the legal landscape of their case. Suddenly, Elena wasn't just a treasure hunter trying to keep valuable artifacts for personal profit. She was a historical preservationist, ensuring that Civil War artifacts would be properly studied and displayed for future generations. The donation also provided her with powerful allies. The Smithsonian's legal team joined her case as interested parties, bringing resources and expertise that Victor Blackwood's foundation couldn't match. More importantly, the museum's involvement brought national media attention that exposed the Blackwood Foundation's controversial political agenda. Throughout this turbulent time, Michael became a steady presence in their lives. He drove Thomas to school in Fairmont, when Elena had court appearances, help with cabin repairs during weekends, and spent evenings on the porch discussing strategy and next steps. Thomas began calling him Uncle Mike after the second month, a designation that brought an unexpected warmth to the professor's usually reserved demeanor. The final confrontation came during a court hearing that drew reporters from 3 states. Victor Blackwood took the witness stand to argue his family's historical claim to the treasure, but his testimony fell apart under cross-examination when Elena's lawyer introduced evidence of the foundation's ties to organizations that promoted Confederate revisionist history. Mr. Blackwood, is it true that your foundation has funded monuments that referred to enslaved people as workers and the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. Our foundation supports historical accuracy. Victor answered his confidence, wavering for the first time, including the historical accuracy that slavery was beneficial to African Americans and that the Confederacy fought for states' rights rather than the preservation of slavery. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Victor's lawyer winced visibly, and several reporters began typing furiously on their laptops. When he left the witness stand, Elena could see that he'd lost both the legal argument and the public relations battle. Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to the historical Morrison who'd hidden the treasure, delivered her verdict with the measured authority of someone who understood the broader implications of her decision. This court finds that the recovered artifacts legally belong to Mrs. Elena Winters as the heir to the property where they were discovered. Furthermore, this court commends Mrs. Winters for her decision to donate a significant portion of the treasure to the Smithsonian Institution, ensuring that these historically significant artifacts will be preserved and displayed for educational purposes. The judge's final words addressed the courtroom full of reporters and interested observers. Let this case serve as an example that our historical artifacts belong not to those who would use them to promote political agendas, but to all Americans who seek to understand our past honestly and completely. As Elena left the courthouse with Thomas and Michael, she felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd been carrying since the day they first arrived at Devil's Hollow. The treasure was legally theirs. The Blackwood Foundation's claims had been rejected, and half of the recovered gold was already on its way to Washington, D.C., where it would be studied by historians and displayed for millions of visitors. Mom Thomas said as they walked to their car. Uncle Gregory's ghost says thank you. Elena smiled and squeezed her son's hand. Tell him he's welcome. The 6 months following the court decision brought dramatic changes to their lives. With the legal issues resolved, Elena used part of the treasure proceeds to renovate the cabin at Devil's Hollow, transforming it from a ramshackle structure into a comfortable home that retained its rustic character while providing modern amenities. The roof no longer leaked, the windows sealed properly against the mountain winds, and the kitchen gleamed with new appliances, though Uncle Gregory's rocking chair remained in its place of honor on the front porch. Thomas started second grade at the local elementary school, where his classmates regarded him with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Being the boy who found Confederate gold made him briefly famous, but his teacher reported that he remained the same thoughtful, observant child he had always been, though he now wrote surprisingly detailed essays about Civil War history that sometimes contained information not found in the textbooks. Elena and Michael established a historical preservation consulting business, specializing in helping other families navigate the complex legal and historical issues surrounding archaeological discoveries on private property. They traveled to historical conferences together, developed educational programs for schools, and spent evenings discussing new projects on the cabin's porch, while Thomas conducted what he called his scientific explorations of the lakeshore. Their relationship had evolved gradually from professional colleagues to something deeper, built on shared purpose and mutual respect. When Michael first kissed Elena on a crisp autumn evening while Thomas was staying overnight with a school friend, it felt like the natural culmination of a journey that had begun the day he first appeared on her porch, examining the documents she'd left on the kitchen table. 1 year after they'd first arrived at Devil's Hollow, the Smithsonian's special exhibition, Recovered History, The Devil's Hollow Treasure, opened to record attendance. Elena and Thomas were guests of honor at the opening ceremony, where Dr. Chen unveiled a life-size photograph of Uncle Gregory Stone alongside the display of Confederate gold coins. Gregory Stone knew that history belongs to those who preserve it, honestly read the inscription beneath his picture. His 4 decades of dedicated research led to one of the most significant Civil War artifact recoveries of the century. Thomas stood before the display case containing the strongbox. They'd recovered, his face reflected in the glass that protected the historical treasures. His fingers traced the outline of the Confederate Treasury seal without actually touching the display. Do you think other people can hear what the lake tells them? He asked Elena as they moved through the crowded exhibition hall. I think some people are better at listening than others, Elena replied, and I think you have a very special gift. The Blackwood family's final appeal had been dismissed the previous week, closing the legal chapter of their story. Victor Blackwood himself had withdrawn from public life, his foundation's revisionist agenda exposed and discredited by the media coverage surrounding the court case. The triumph of historical accuracy over political manipulation had become an unexpected subplot in what the Washington Post called the treasure story of the decade. Back at Devil's Hollow that evening, Elena sat on the porch with Michael and Thomas watching the first snow of the season dust the dark surface of the lake with delicate white flakes. Michael had brought hot chocolate, and Thomas was eagerly describing his plans for mapping the underwater contours of the lake basin using sonar equipment borrowed from the college's geology department. The lakes changed him, Michael observed quietly as Thomas went inside to retrieve his notebook of lake observations. His connection to this place goes beyond anything I've seen in 40 years of historical research. Elena nodded, watching the snowflakes dissolve into the dark water, creating momentary stars on the lake's surface before they disappeared. Sometimes I wonder if Uncle Gregory somehow knew Thomas would be the one to find what he'd been looking for all those years. If that's why he left this place to us, specifically. Michael considered this possibility with the seriousness of a man who'd seen enough of life's mysteries to remain open-minded. Gregory was a complex man, more intuitive than most academics I've known. He told me once that he believed certain places choose their own guardians, that Devil's Hollow had chosen him, and someday it would choose someone else. The following spring brought unexpected recognition when the American Historical Association awarded Elena and Thomas their annual Public History Award for extraordinary contributions to historical preservation and public education. The ceremony in Washington coincided with the first anniversary of the Smithsonian exhibition, which had become one of the most visited displays in the museum's history. Thomas, dressed in his first suit, accepted the award with the poise of a child accustomed to being taken seriously by adults. When asked by a reporter what he planned to do next, he answered with characteristic directness, "I'm going to keep listening to what the lake wants to tell us. There are still a lot of stories down there waiting to be heard." The recognition opened new opportunities for their consulting business. Schools throughout the region adopted the curriculum about responsible treasure hunting that Elena and Michael had developed, which emphasized historical context and preservation rather than monetary value. Their foundation began providing grants to legitimate historical preservation projects, particularly those focused on underrepresented perspectives on Civil War history. The irony wasn't lost on Elena that Confederate gold was now funding efforts to ensure that the experiences of enslaved people and freed slaves would be preserved and honored. One afternoon in late spring, as Thomas conducted another of his meticulous surveys of the lake's edge, he called Elena over with unusual urgency. His hands were cupped around something small he'd found half buried in the sand. "Mom, look. It's Uncle Gregory's pocket watch." Elena examined the tarnished silver timepiece that Thomas had uncovered. It was indeed the same watch she'd seen in the photograph on Uncle Gregory's nightstand, an antique with a distinctive engraving on the case. But how had it ended up buried by the lake? Thomas carefully opened the watch, revealing something tucked inside the case, a tiny folded paper that had been protected from the elements. Elena gently extracted and unfolded it, recognizing Uncle Gregory's handwriting immediately. "For David's son," the note read. "If you've found this, then you've proven yourself the rightful guardian of Devil's Hollow. The lake has accepted you as it once accepted me. Listen to its stories, protect its secrets, and remember that the greatest treasures are those that cannot be measured in gold." Thomas ran his finger over the faded writing, his expression solemn. "How did he know I would find this? How did he know I would be a boy?" "Some questions don't have easy answers," Elena replied, though she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring breeze. Uncle Gregory understood things about this place that we're still discovering. That night, as they sat together on the porch watching fireflies begin their summer dance above the water, Thomas asked the question that had been forming in his mind since finding the watch. "Do you think the lake is magic, Mom?" Elena considered her answer carefully, aware that Michael was listening from his place beside her. "I think there are connections in this world that we don't fully understand, between people and places, between the past and the present. Some might call that magic. Others might call it something else. What matters is that we respect those connections and learn from them." Thomas nodded, satisfied with her answer. Then he pointed to a spot near the center of the lake where the water seemed to shimmer differently than its surroundings. "There's something else down there, something we haven't found yet, but it's not time yet. The lake will tell us when it's ready." Elena put her arm around her son's shoulders, no longer surprised by his perceptions. She exchanged a glance with Michael, who nodded slightly. They had both learned to trust Thomas's intuition about the lake, Whatever secrets still lay in its depths would reveal themselves in time, and they would be there when they did, ready to ensure that the past was preserved truthfully for the future. As twilight deepened and stars began to appear in the sky above Devil's Hollow, Elena felt a profound sense of gratitude settle over her. For Uncle Gregory's stubborn persistence, for Thomas's remarkable intuition, for Michael's scholarly dedication, for Martha's timely intervention, even in a strange way for Victor Blackwood's opposition, which had forced them to fight for something worth preserving. The lake reflected the evening stars, its surface calm, now that spring had fully established itself. Thomas had fallen asleep against Michael's shoulder, exhausted from his day of exploration. Elena watched them both, marveling at how completely their lives had transformed in less than 2 years. From counting coins on a kitchen table to establishing a foundation that would preserve historical sites for generations to come. From a cramped apartment above a diner to a beautifully renovated lakeside home, it filled with books, art, and the comfortable sense of permanence she'd never dared hope for. Devil's Hollow had once been a place of darkness and loss. Now it was a place of light and discovery. And that transformation from emptiness to purpose, from isolation to connection, was the real treasure they had unearthed together. Elena took Michael's hand as they watched over Thomas in the lake. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. Whatever secrets the lake might still hold, they would uncover them when the time was right. And whatever stories remained to be told, they would ensure they were preserved with honesty and care. The inheritance that had begun as a burden property, no one wanted a lake with a dark reputation, had become the foundation for a future none of them could have imagined. As the stars multiplied in the darkening sky, Elena understood what Uncle Gregory had spent 40 years searching for. Not just gold or historical artifacts, but a sense of purpose and belonging. A place where past and present converged to create meaning. In finding the treasure they had discovered something far more valuable, a home where history was alive and continuing to unfold. A legacy that would endure long after the gold itself had been forgotten. As Thomas slept peacefully between them, Elena and Michael kept watch over Devil's Hollow, its dark waters now, a repository of possibility rather than secrets. The lake that had once held a nation's buried past now cradled their shared future. And in that moment of quiet connection, Elena knew with absolute certainty that they had found exactly where they belonged.